my name is Za'Kyah, and shockingly, I am the president of the Research Club. So today we'll be discussing women and the Constitution. So we welcome you to any questions, comments, concerns. So we are going to start off with Jessica Johnson. Okay, we're going to start with both of them and not just one.
We want to thank Za'Kyah for that warm and friendly introduction to today's Constitution Day. And how's our volume? So what we decided would be maybe a good topic for today would be women in the Constitution. So I'll begin, then Jessica will talk for a while, and then I'll come and conclude. After which, take notes because you will have a quiz, I understand, from the dean. So brief reflection on the position of women in the early colonial period reveals that both enslaved and married women were for legal purposes property. Unmarried women, on the other hand, were viewed with suspicion and if wealthy could face a spectrum of hostility with the worst of the behavior mounting toward violence, reaching its nadir in 1692 during the Salem witch trials, where of the 200 accused, 14 women were hung. In the 1880s, things had progressed some, but if you were a woman, you on average gave birth to 7 children, with some having as many as 10, 14, or even 20, without necessarily wanting to. Some methods of birth control became available finally in the 20th century when Margaret Sanger opened a family planning clinic in Brooklyn in 1916. Research for birth control in the form of a pill began through her support in 1950, coming available a decade later, allowing the masses of working and middle-class women to dream of becoming educated, having careers outside the home, and living independent, self-directed lives for the first time in history. And yet, questions about women, childbirth, and who owns the wombs that produce and populate societies remain in both popular and legal culture. Many a student of history has strained to find the subject American womanhood, or even women, in the nation's great governing document, the U.S. Constitution. Drafted secretly in the summer of 1787, in the time of Revolutionary War, against a despotic king, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention signed their guiding instrument in September of that year. But right away, philosophical and political angst arose, with only 39 of 55 present being willing to sign. Some thought that more power should be reserved to the individuals and for the states. Secretary of the Treasury, as you know, Alexander Hamilton, was a Federalist and defended the wide-ranging powers assigned to the new government, while Thomas Jefferson, an anti-Federalist, opposed the document prolifically in print. James Madison, in 1789, a year after ratification of the Constitution by the states, sought to bridge the divide between the founders, offering the first 10 amendments to the Constitution as the Bill of Rights. You will recall the First Amendment: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and of religion. And of course, the Second Amendment is also in the press lately with the right to bear arms. And although all 10 protect the citizen from overreach by the state, it is the very First Amendment to the Constitution which begins, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting free exercise thereof." This was ratified in 1791. Thomas Jefferson referred to this phrase as the Establishment Clause, specifically because it created, quote, "a wall of separation between church and state, thereby protecting individuals from a national, quote, a national government imposing a specific set of religious beliefs." You might can see where this is going. Technically, it can be argued that Jefferson inherited his reasoning from the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke, who wrote in his letter concerning toleration, quote, that the church had overstepped its proper boundaries. So, our National Bill of Rights was issued the same year that the people of France declared independence from their monarchy, which origins went all the way back to the Middle Ages, titling their new governing tool the, quote, Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. 24 months later, French woman Olympia de Gouges would publish her Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, in answer to having been let out of the French Liberation masterpiece. It would be almost 5 decades on that American women would pen their answer to their rights being ignored by the nation's founders stateside. In July of 19th through 20th, in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote on behalf of American women, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal." And this was dubbed the Declaration on Sentiments at that first meeting at Seneca Falls, New York, formally launching what is known as the first wave of the women's movement in the United States. Cady Stanton declared, quote, "It is the duty of women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise to vote." Now this largely, but not entirely, was a movement of white women for white women, but Mary Church Burrell, an African-American woman, said in 1898 before the National American Women's Suffrage Association that she expected liberation to be about both race and sex. For another 6 decades, women organized, but it would take Alice Paul, Quaker, intellectual and activist, a woman nearly scrubbed from many history texts, and a leader criticized for, quote, "radical tactics" to win this struggle. It is perhaps painful to face the fact that for 131 years, between 1788, when we got the Constitution ratified, and 1919, the nation's first 31 years of existence, that American women were prescribed neither equality nor any rights at all. And, as our USC Union students, at least in my classes, can attest to, the narrative which recounts female access to the franchise as gained through peace marches by middle-class women is patently false. Our elder sisters struggled in pitched battles where suffragists endured beatings by police, imprisonment by courts, and force feeding and other forms of violence from wardens and prison guards. This should surprise no one, since, according to the Colonel Walter Hitchcock, an address to recruits at Roswell Military Institute in New Mexico, freedom is never free. Put another way, famously by the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass on August 3rd, 1857, in a speech in New York State in the celebration of independence from for the West Indies, he said, "Power concedes nothing without demand," quote, and another quote, "The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress," and another quote, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." Douglass had escaped slavery before becoming a world-renowned speaker for human rights and had witnessed the treatment of women firsthand on the plantation, including his aunt who was beaten because she won't give in to sexual exploitation. And he'd even witnessed it in the abolitionist movement itself. After all, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott had traveled with Douglass to the World's Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840. And after weeks in crossing the Atlantic, if you can imagine how that was on that ship, his companions were not allowed to participate in the proceedings at the convention because they were women. This great rebuff caused rage, as you might imagine, and some women who had been involved in the abolitionist movement began to focus more singularly upon women's rights. Frederick Douglass had been one of the few male invited speakers at the Seneca Falls Convention, and one of 2 nationally prominent men to embrace feminism in the 19th century, the other being William Lloyd Garrison, and Douglass had urged the women forward. For himself, Douglass understood what only we now, 2 decades into the 21st century, have found the words to describe, which is that there is an intersectionality between different kinds of oppression, race, class, gender. But there's also convergence and crossing, conversely, when our freedom movements converge. Moving forward in time, there was a split in the suffrage organization, the National Women's Suffrage Association. Because of strategies, some of the women breaking off into the American Women's Suffrage Association in the 1860s through the 1880s. But the women pulled back together and recombined this in the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1890. By 1950, this was being well led by Carrie Chapman Catt, who had become the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and she decided that the strategy would be to win suffrage state by state, respectively and respectably. However, Alice Paul, a Quaker, would appear fresh as a suffragist from her work in England, and Paul had not the patience of Catt, nor did she have one eye on respectability, and strategically worked to mend the gaping hole in the fabric of democracy, and it was she who led the marches which ended in clashes with the police and imprisonment. After initially trying to work with Kat and the NASA, Paul broke away, and on August 18, 1920, Paul and her comrades in the new National Women's Party were able to see the actual passage of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution passed by Congress, giving American women the right to vote. It was with great celebration that the National Women's Party, notwithstanding their split from NASA, stood together on the grounds that women now had the right to vote. And a jubilant Alice Paul came back the following year in 1921 with a masterful draft of legislation for an equal rights amendment for women. This amendment, in addition to the 20th, if passed, would forever secure women's equality by adjoining its promise of equal footing between the sexes to the United States Constitution by declaring full citizenship to half of the population, something cruelly withheld or woefully overlooked by the nation's founders. The democracy would be made more complete and less rife with hypocrisy. In spite, though, of our mother's strivings, Paul's ERA and its defeat in Congress marked a silver ending of the first wave of the women's movement. And now we're going to go to the second wave.
The second wave, full personhood, full citizenship. The second wave of the women's movement was synergized through women's participation, first in the voting rights movement and later in the aspects of the civil rights movement. As a new generation of women, all of ethnicities gained practice in protesting and demonstration. The women put new coals under the struggle for equality between the sexes and genders. Gloria Steinem founded the first modern feminist journal dedicated to women's rights in 1971 and called it MS. Steinem and other feminist leaders challenged men for equality in the workforce, removal of discrimination in the workplace, condemned violence against women in the forms of sex crimes, rape, incest, trafficking, and harassment, and created networks of escape for women and children experiencing domestic violence. Waddell Reed was Barry Frieden's 1973 book, The Feminine Mystique, pointing out that white women were highly dissatisfied at having been workers during World War II, only to be forced out of gainful employment in the post-war era. National figures like Steinem helped to create movement hubs, but feminist associations sprang up and or grew in membership all around the country. It was from these centers of mass organization that women demanded equal pay and the right to control one's own body in terms of decision-making over reproduction. By its very name, MS Magazine helped to rid the culture of the practice of identifying every female person as either married, Mrs., or unmarried, Miss, preferring the neutral Miss as the appropriate counterpart to Mr. with all that it accomplished, such as narrowing the wage gap between men and women with each passing decade. In 2008, women made 77 cents to every dollar made by men. In 2023, it is 83 cents to a dollar. It would be false to paint that women's movement as unilateral. In the 1980s and 1990s, feminism split into factions wherein African American women, Latin women, working class women, and lesbian and gender fluid women used their voices and organizing prowess to posit their white middle class women's outlook and priorities did not meet their interests or needs. A publication by activist scholar Angela Davis pointed to the overlapping oppressions in women, gender, race, and class that Douglas had recognized a century earlier. Now in 2023, in what it appears to be the waning second wave of women's movement, and one hopes the beginning of the third wave. MS Magazine is still being published, but so are other women's voices. See Karen Blair's The Club Woman as Feminist, Bell Hooks, A9 Woman, Patricia Hill Collins, Black feminist thought, Patricia Morton's disfigured images, the historical assault on Afro-American women, Betty Collier Thomas and V.P. Franklin's sisters in the struggle, Philip S. Bonner's Women and the American Labor Movement, Gender Talk, The Struggle for Women's Equality in African American Communities by Jonetta Cole and Beverly Guy Scheffel, Intersectionality by Patricia Hill Collins and Sturma Bilge, and Unequal Sisters, an Inclusive Reader in U.S. Women's History by Ruiz et al. In all of their pages encompasses webinars and on the streets. Feminists and womanists argue that repression has cost us another 100 years of African American women labors, and still the ERA has still not been born into the American conscience or consciousness. For what is the Equal Rights Amendment but an idea in the furtherance of our national idea of democracy and its application across gender and sex?
At the present hour, feminists report with dismay that rather than gaining strength, democracy is backsliding. They are referring in part to the United States Supreme Court decision issued on June 24th, 2022, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. This ruling reversed the landmark Supreme Court ruling, Roe v. Wade, of January 1973, which made abortion a legal option for women in all 50 states. In a speech before the United Nations Fourth World Conference in Beijing, China, in September of 1995, then First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton said, "Women's rights are human rights." As such, as we speak here today, women's rights activists are planning forums and confronting the current political climate and its, quote, rise of global authoritism, which brings with it an attempt to limit all human freedoms, eradicating our rights to hard-fought and hard-won freedoms, among which the most highly treasured is the right to self-determination. Of this moment, and in consideration of the complications and dangers to women's health and very lives in the weeks and months following Dobbs, the fleeing of medical professionals from states with 6 and even 15-week bans on abortion, and the outline of states in self-managed abortion through medication, reports abound of women and families being forced to carry non-viable fetuses to term, leading to trauma and mental anguish. Other reports have reached the national news cycles of girls who've been raped, being forced to give birth, or to travel from state to state when their families can afford it, desperately seeking medical care. It would seem that cruelty is being piled upon cruelty. A word for those who believe that never should a pregnancy be terminated. We would plead that we could explore solutions involving the paradigm shift, where some of the burden is shifted to men who are present at procreation. One creative idea is to found a movement for temporary vasectomy for boys at the onset of puberty to be lifted by state decree with a certificate of allowance for reversal surgery when a man signs a contract of agreement to parenthood. I raised this very idea with my own adult son, who said that he personally, along with other men he knew, would respond to such an effort violently. Where will we as a nation, which is a republic, recognize that the moral right to life, liberty, and happiness could never end at birth? Our foremothers wrote that girls and women have the same right to life, liberty, and happiness, quote unquote, afforded to men in the Constitution, given that these inalienable rights come by God, whether men vote in favor or not. The purpose of government, argues Katie Stanton, is to secure these very rights. She observes coolly that the government derives its power through and only through the consent of those governed. To her point, Frederick Douglass adds that, quote, the fight against oppression is both moral and physical, unquote. If so, and the spirit of the law, whether one's spiritual or religious view of contraception and abortion, whatever it is, and the right that people do have full right to the expression, to the religious expression of such rights within one's own religious circles, still does not permit one to stand under shade and protection of the U.S. Constitution and claim that a girl or woman's right to life and liberty is removed by the right to life of the unborn. To say that the government has no right to make any determination of what goes on between a woman and her womb is not necessarily to favor abortion as a solution to reproductive health by any means. It is rather to lay bare the real question of our belief in our form of government inside of a people who claim for democracy. And so we ask, with the immediate thunderous and resounding answer already in our ears, does this state have place? Thank you for your attention.